Okay, first game in the Spring Online Congress for NCL. Playing as black. Blocked off the pawn. Developed the knight. Captured, trying to open up the centre. At this point here I thought, very aggressive opening. I did think to myself, who plays like this when they're playing as white? And of course I play like this when I'm playing as white. Attacking the weak pawn here, waiting to get the bishop out to attack the queen with the support from the knight, potentially even the knight coming here at some stage. Looking at the pressure on the king area in the early part of the game. So I went into the mindset of playing as white and looked at what hurt white in this situation. What would prevent them from getting their ultimate area of attack. And this key square here, decided to bring the bishop out, just protecting against the bishop and the knight combination. Our opponent made a move which I believed was losing them tempo, because playing as white you're a move up, so you have a bit more advantage. But the opponent played this move and I've believed that it lost them that moment of tempo. So it gave us the opportunity to develop our knight, to give space for castling at some stage, but also attacking a weak pawn here. Opponent pushes the pawn down. I did sit for a while thinking about what to do with this particular move, and I had a fancy movement came into my head, and all my processes of focusing on the king area, keeping it simple, direct moves to remove pieces from the board, they sort of momentarily disappeared from my mental processes, because I had this fancy idea of bringing the knight here to then come back around and attack their knight. If the bishop took or the knight took, then our bishop takes. But then I sat and thought for a while, this queen is going to have access to this key square. And what does he have there? He has the bishop here. So after those exchanges, he would be potentially getting a checkmate position, or pressuring me to actually lose tempo, and then I'm down a piece. So it would be knight, knight, say the knight takes, bishop takes, bishop takes, but before it does all that bishop taking, the queen would come in here. So then my queen would have to come and defend this pawn. So we wouldn't be in the best shape possible. So after I'd done the move, I realised that that continuation really wasn't going to work for us. But luckily, the opponent made the queen move. At this point here, looking at the simple direct moves to remove pieces from the board, gravitating towards the king area, I brought myself back into myself and targeted a weak area. Smaller piece attacking a higher piece, can't be wrong. Yes, the opponent could have done en passant, which would have been fairly favourable for them up to a point. But the knight can just come back and attack, and it's attacking the bishop. So in that sense there, we would have been in a better position. So it worked out nicely for us, this type of continuation, rather than this fancy knight maneuver, which looked good initially. It's not to say the opponent would have spotted the queen coming here and attacking this here, but the potential was there, and I always whenever I'm playing a person, I'm playing the board and I'm playing the moves, and I'm always almost overestimating the opponent's skill levels. I treat them like I'm playing a master or a grandmaster. So I have to be very careful. So it's okay, I wasn't in a bad position, I wasn't going to follow through with that particular movement, so how then could we move forward from there? So they brought their bishop attacking our knight, we brought the bishop protecting the knight, still got the pawn protecting our knight on this side here, and then they captured. At this point here, we could put pressure onto their bishop to establish a smaller piece attacking a higher piece, so giving them something to think about. At this stage here, I was saying to myself, I'm probably two tempi up now, 2 moves up, based on the movements of what the opponent had done, especially with the first pawn move here, then this bishop movement. I seem to be winning a little bit of time, and they moved the bishop back rather than capturing, so I'm feeling like I've won 3 movement tempos from this particular position. So we bring the bishop, attack, putting the pressure onto the king. So if we get a moment to put pressure onto the king over attacking a piece, 9 times out of 10 go for that. And then we go for simple exchanges here, simple moves to take pieces off the board. Whether it's right or not, we took them off anyway. So captured, and they captured. Looking for a discover check on the bishop. If they forget themselves, then we can take the bishop off the board. Computer doesn't like that sort of movement, it's showing that white is in advantage at the minute. So we capture the bishop. So at this stage here, looked long and hard at the potential for pawn majority, because this is like going close to an end game position. I was focused on the end game position right from the beginning, but I kind of messed it up a little bit in terms of putting my knight there, so it's not really the sort of position that I'm used to playing in. So the opponent gave us the opportunities to take the pieces off of the board, so we took it straight away because I wasn't really happy with the knight being in this position. So now our focal point is on looking at how the pawn structure is going to be settled, how we're going to then try and gain some advantages. It's possibly showing that white is in advantageous position at the moment because of the advanced pawns that they've got in the center of the board. So my key aspect was around thinking, how do we block this pawn off or capture this pawn to then establish a strength up on our king side, because we have a pawn majority on the queen side. So I wasn't too bothered about those, potentially looking at creating some type of opening for our rooks to play, because at the moment there isn't really anything. There's a half open file here that the rook is probably they're going to potentially try and own. Obviously they'll be coming behind this pawn to try and protect this pawn. In the meantime, is there a way of putting pressure towards their king area? I had sights of bringing my queen here to come here to touch onto the king if they didn't go and castle, to try and win some more tempo, because sometimes players don't castle, they want to take advantage of certain things. So that was the idea. So after all of that, I looked at the pawn majority on our side, looked at the power base that we've got the queen, get it facing the king. So that was the general idea. They castled and we castled. So at this point, as we mentioned, the rook is looking to challenge this pawn, but to me again, I feel like I'm 4 moves up now, because the opponent is attacking a pawn that is easily defended, because the pawn can just push up here, and even if they double up their rooks on here, I don't think they're going to actually capture the pawn, because the pawn will just take it back. So in my heart of hearts, felt like I was winning 4 tempo. Obviously the evaluation bar is showing that white is still in advantageous position, but for my game I felt we were like 4 moves up. So we pushed the pawn just to defend that pawn off, and as we mentioned, rook coming to support this pawn here. Again, I'm even going to push it to basically feeling like I was 5 moves up, because we'd covered off the base that this is not going to be really a strong attacking area for the opponent because it's blocked off for the rook. This is supporting a pawn that really isn't got any, it's not got any traction as yet to actually push forward. We're looking to disturb, if any pawns come down here, get some activity up on a half open file or open file on the far side if we can. Still wanted to get the queen into action somehow, to get a nice diagonal, still focusing maybe on potentially coming across here to maybe control this square here, in order for us to establish an attack going across towards the queenside area to support our pawn majority. So it was like a long-term thinking thing. I just didn't want my queens sitting there in the middle of the board really doing nothing. Also, it has the added impact of putting pressure towards the king area subliminally. Yep. So sights of sitting here type thing, looking potentially for rook rovers, all that sort of stuff. But initially had sights of the queen coming here for an immediate impact on this square here in this area, depending on what the opponent did. So we brought the queen up, and then they went for a queen exchange. And I did sit for a while thinking, well, it's not circumvented what we wanted to do. It may have basically enhanced what we wanted to do, because his rook's going to have to come down. So it's not then linked together. So it might be a plus. They lose a little bit of tempo, so 6 moves behind in my head. That's how I was working it. Because the opponent is doing stuff that they don't really want to do. They're losing that momentum in terms of attack formation. Our idea was basically having something to block this knight, this pawn off. And while I was thinking of this exchange potential, I was thinking about this pawn. This pawn was a crucial thing as far as I could see, because it was like a semi-pass pawn. We've got our little pawn here that could do something, but not yet. It needed a bit of work, it needed a bit of support. So the only piece that really could look at blocking this pawn, I don't want a rook blocking it, is the knight. So how could we fashion getting that knight to block that pawn? So before we even took this queen, I decided that yes, I am going to take this queen. The rook is going to be down there. We then need to look at blocking this pawn off and making our weak area our strength. This was our weak area. This pawn was our weak area as well. So in essence, if our knight did get to sit here, blocking off, this is all future tensing, yeah. My calculations went up to 4 moves at that stage. So it was basically going, yes, we capture, then they go here. Then we're looking at some stage basically getting this pawn, but we need to get this rook moved out of the way so that the knight can come, something like that, to come here, to go there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Is it 4 or 5? Is that 1, 2, 3, 4? Yeah, we went to 5. Okay. So that's the sort of pattern that we were looking at. So we captured and they captured, and we brought the rook through as we did from our calculation, and then they doubled up. So they doubled up on a pawn that really, in my head, didn't need doubling up. So I'm now saying to myself, I am 7 moves up in this game. It's showing as a draw, but how do I break the draw? I break the draw by following the plan that I'd set, which was to get this pawn blocked off as best possible, and then turn it into our strength by attacking slowly but surely on this pawn, on the head of the snake. But we can't do that just yet. So we move the knight, as we said in the calculation, looking to bring it down here to come up to here to block. And it all depends on what the opponent does, and the opponent moved this pawn down again. This is like move number 8 that I'm up now, based on what the opponent has done, because there's nothing threatening, there's no key attacks being made on our pieces, so I wasn't really worried about anything. I just needed to make sure that I could block off their attack area. So we brought the knight down like we said, and 9 moves up now. This king move I didn't understand again, what was actually happening on that side. So it was like not a non-move, it's just that there was no meat on the bones, there was no attack formation, so it allowed us to block off the main area, their strength, with the knight. So at this point here, the gauge bar is showing they've got a slight advantage. In my head I'm 9 moves up, there is no advantage here now. The advantage they had was with this pawn, and I believe somehow if they had moved their knight around and maybe even attempted to push the pawn down earlier, they would have had a better file advantage. But I didn't want them to do that, and so this is why we're in this current situation at the moment. So now the rook moves across, attacking the pawn that can't be taken. So I did sit and wonder, how are we going to work this? And the weakest pawn that I had on my strong side was this pawn here, and I didn't want a rook supporting this pawn. So this knight had a twofold strength, because it could come here to protect this pawn, because I immediately had visions of him dropping here and coming here type of thing to put pressure on this pawn. Or if he started pushing the pawns down towards this area, trying to open it up, then this pawn is weak. But I definitely didn't want a rook supporting this pawn. So this was the moment where I attacked their strong side to try and make it weak for them and make it strong for us. And they see what I'm trying to do, but even then I still believe maybe if they captured it or did something proactive in this area, I may have been struggling. But they pushed down more with the pawn, so 10 moves up now, based on these small incremental steps. Yes, the gauge bar is showing it's a draw, but in my head I'm going, well, I'm 10 moves up, I should be able to make something of this now, because of the work that we've done on our weak area to protect our weak area. We should now be able to establish small incremental steps towards their king area if we work our pieces together. But the whole focus isn't just going to be on the king side. We also need to be mindful of the potential work that could go on around here, and especially on our weak pawn here, which is on our strong side. So basically it'll be attacking the back end of the snake. So we're attacking the head of their snake, and their strength would be attacking our back end of our snake. So we block off this pawn because it's a Scud missile, and we don't like the Scud missiles pushing down any further, especially in a serious game. And We've also got the pawn supporting here because the knight can't jump to this square, so fairly comfortable with that. As soon as you see Lazy Man's chest, I know full well, looks like they've run out of moves. So again, that gave me, in my head, the extra tempo, now 1 to 11. So I was feeling quite good about the development, especially around our weak area. We're now 11 moves up in terms of being able to gain advantage in the game. That's how I felt anyway. You look on the board and I'm thinking, well, you know, could be a draw here. Yeah, could be a draw quite easily. If he offered a draw though, I probably would have said no, because I believed the 11 moves up situation was going to work for me. So then they pushed this pawn here, and after that pawn move was made, I said definitely not going for a draw now. Yep. The early part was like, well, maybe, but no. And this really concreted the fact that I wasn't going to, because I was looking for my rook to potentially be owning around this area if possible, depending on what the opponent did, and pressuring towards this area here, which would give us a good in. This pawn, the head of the snake, is definitely weak, so taking this pawn off the board would take away the strength that they feel they may have had, because if the pawn takes, our knight is still blocking. If the knight takes, then the knight has not got anywhere to go. So we pushed onto the pawn. This was the attack along our strong area. And surprisingly, they did capture. I didn't think they would capture, actually. I thought they would just sort of sit and wait it out. So gauged by showing with slight advantage, but I felt fairly confident about the fact of we were going to attempt to own this area no matter what they did. So we captured the pawn, and now the rook is attacking the weak pawn. The weak pawn that we had already said is potentially going to be attacked. It's the back of the snake. So the knight coming here is the most favourable option for myself, because I don't want a rook protecting the pawn. This rook can come up and protect it at a later stage if this rook moves away from this area. So we bring the knight down and the king comes down, and again, not too sure. I think that maybe the king was coming here to start pushing onto this pawn here with the support, so we took advantage of that by attacking the knight, which is no longer defended by the king. So again, they bring the king back. So like I say, probably on 13 moves up now, based on simple moves, simple positioning on the board. Then we capture. We eventually capture this pawn in the center here, and they do capture with the knight. The knight is supported by this pawn, and like we said earlier, the knight really doesn't have anywhere to go to be of any benefit. I mean, going here, it's not attacking anything. If it goes here, it's not attacking anything. It's not supporting anything either. So our rook could freely come down and attack this pawn if need be. So we bring the rook down, and now they're having to do stuff they don't want to do, which is the rook supporting this pawn. So this is that accumulation of being down so many moves. Now they're having to track back to try and grab back these 13 moves. It's a weird psychology, but I understand what I'm talking about. Okay, so 13 moves they've got to claw back in order to gain an advantage in the game. So we bring the rook up now. The reason being is we want to bring our knight here to put a 2-on-1 on this pawn, because we would have the rook and the knight facing this pawn. So we didn't want to bring the knight up there first, because his rook would have taken our weak pawn here on the bottom. So they pushed the pawn down, and this was move 14 14 moves behind. It's like being late to a party. You miss all the activity that is actually building up around you. So we bring the knight up, like we said, putting the 2-on-1 on the pawn, and the knight moves back to support the pawn, putting the 2-on-1 here. Like I said, it's 14 moves behind. There's a lot of moves to be behind. It's an accumulation of those moves though. As you can see, the slate gauge bar is slowly pushing up for us. Not that I'm putting any weight too much on the evaluation bar, because it wasn't in our favour when we're accumulating these 14 moves. So we bring the rook back, again putting pressure onto the knight, holding the king to ransom, so the king has to still support the knight. And this was the second to longest move that I would make in this game. I took absolutely ages over this particular move because of the options. I had the options of bringing my rook down here, bringing the rook all the way back, you know, to support, maybe doubling up on this side here. And I was sat there for ages. I was thinking, okay, so when I do take, if I do take, his pawn takes, his rook's not going to come all the way back here to come round the back to put a check on, because that's too slow. Could do, but it's too slow. So taking, he takes. What's the advantage for us? Could push the pawn here to develop a blocker towards his strength area, because he's got 3 pawns actually coming down, so we'd need to get rid of that strength area with the attempt of the pawn pushing onto the knight. So that was a clear thought in my head. We've blocked off the attack area for this rook coming down to attack here, because his pawn would be here, so that's a bonus. But bringing the rook here seemed quite tantalizing, because it's still putting that 2-on-1 aspect onto the pawn. And then I went back to the concept: simple direct moves to remove pieces from the board strategically. So after all of those thought processes of potentially going here, you know, to stop the pawn here, having his pawn here blocking this rook from actually attacking this pawn, strategically that seemed sound to me. So we ended up grabbing the pawn and then they took back. And we followed the process of looking at his area of strength again, as we mentioned, the potential pawn for pushing down here. And then they made this rook move here, and this was the longest thing I believe I had in this game, because I sat there, he moved there really quickly. It was under 10 seconds, under 5 I think. He moved there dead quick, because he had sights of the fact that he's got a pin on my rook for some reason, I believe. So I don't know if he was still thinking he was going to push his pawn down here on my knight, but obviously this pawn would take there. And then I don't know what other thoughts he may have had, maybe the knight coming here. Yep, something like that, attacking the knight. So that potentially was the type of thought process that they had. My thought process, why it took so long, was the fact that that shape that he's got there was the shape that the knight could take. So the knight could take this pawn. He's got a check on the king, and he's got a check on the rook. So he's got a check on the king, so he has to do something, because they've got the check on the king. So his rook can't come down and take our rook, because he has to do something with his king. So he'd have to move his king either to here to protect the rook. And for the life of me, I don't know why I took so long over it. I just felt it just didn't sit right, even though I was getting the check on. I would be winning the rook. So the knight would be here, so the king would have to move. So then the knight would take the rook. Simple. But when you're in these positions like this, you start doubting yourself, because you say to yourself, surely it cannot be that. It can't be that way. I'm not saying it can't be that easy, it's just so we eventually made the move, and then the opponent resigned.